great believer in signs and omens. So when I sent the flyer for today through to my nephew yesterday, and he saw that I was on after a band called Auntie Mary's Second Thoughts, he sent me a text back with, "Oh, Auntie Mary, I hope it's not a sign." And I said, "Well, I do too, because it's actually Gary's and my anniversary today." So I'm always very selective about the overstudy side to believe in those that I don't. I believe in star signs, and I'm a Taurus, and Taurus is looking like not much fun on the side. I've got some of the planet in the ascendancy, and I'll read that one. So we'll just go with what works. So what I want to share with you today is some information that Gary and I use in the work that we do. And it's a really powerful paradigm that you can add to any kind of change approach that you take. And you can also use it on its own. I invite you to listen to this from a place of curiosity, because some of it might go, "Oh, I know this is familiar, it sounds like, positive thinking or positive psychology, or it's strength-based change processes." And it might have elements of those, but there's actually a piece that people usually find to be pretty novel, that can allow for really powerful shifts in your own life and also if you do it. And it fits perfectly in today's topic about cause and effect. So I'd like to introduce you to a young friend of mine called Lucy, for the sake of this. And we meet Lucy at 5 years old. It's her first day of school. And she is beyond excited. She's been waiting for this for ages. She's got the new uniform, the new shoes, which admittedly are a little bit tight because she's been in thongs all summer. But she just feels really pumped for this new adventure in her life. And as she's in the hall, the assembly, for the start of the school year, she sees some of the grade 6 kids on the stage with the teachers. And she's really curious why they're up there and not sitting in the hall with everybody else. So when she asks the question and later finds out, she hears that they are being chosen as house leaders in the school. And their role is to be the liaison between the teachers and the kids. So their first assembly, Lucy has absolutely no doubt that when she gets to grade 6, that's where she wants to be as well. She wants to be a house leader. Now if we jump forward and catch up with Lucy a few years later, we meet a very different little child. She's 10, and she's much less confident than she was. She's become much more quiet, softly spoken, and that dream of standing in front of the school has gone. She wouldn't even consider it. Now, nothing terrible has happened along the way. She's had some teachers that were perhaps a little bit harsher with her than they could have been, and she's had jostling with friends as they've been working out the pecking order and that social stuff that I know I went through. Maybe someone else? Anyone else? Yeah. So it's just, she's just been living, really. But all of those experiences have gradually whittled away her confidence and her belief in herself. And partly that's because the way that the school is structured, and very different to the original talk we heard from John today, but the way the school is structured is very common, and it's that focus on what aren't you doing well so you can do better? What isn't working so we can fix that and improve that so you can? And that had just started to diminish her and how she felt about herself. Now the approach the school takes is not atypical, and there's a reason for it, because evolutionary, for survival, our brains have developed to identify danger. So we need to notice when there are things that aren't right, when things are dangerous and not working, because that helps us to survive. Now there are still times in life when that's appropriate, but the downside is, most of the time, living through life, particularly as a 5 or a 10-year-old at school, she didn't need this kind of brain to be activated. But it was. Now Lucy's really lucky because her mum knows a different way, which we call wholeness conversations. And wholeness conversations are the conversations you have with people where you see them in their wholeness, in their fullest expression, who they truly are. Not the self that's been taught, but the true self. And so as her mum had the conversations with her, she helped Lucy to see
where that whole bright little light was still there. And Lucy felt that because when she was with animals or in nature or doing her art, that's who she still was. So she hadn't actually gone anywhere. It was just in that context of school and with friends, it had started to fade. So as her mum had these wholeness conversations with Lucy, Lucy started to remember who she truly was. And she started to go back into school, into the environment that had previously made her feel small, with the strength of knowing who she truly was inside. So a few weeks ago was grade 6 for Lucy. Where do you think she was on that first day? She was in the front of the room. She was on the stage with the others. Because by the time end of year grade 5 had come, she was confident enough in herself again to put her name forward as a house leader, and her teacher and her friends voted her in. Now imagine the change this is making in Lucy's life. And this is a true story. The pictures obviously aren't, and the name isn't. But this is a true story of a friend of ours. It's a powerful shift. Her mum could have taken the approach to say, okay, so you're not very confident, you're not making eye contact, let's practice making eye contact. Let's practice making you confident with people. And while that would have worked, it would have just kept reinforcing what she wasn't doing well. Instead, the shift was to see who was the Lucy that was still there, that she lost sight of. Another story which really illustrates this beautifully was about 8 or 9 years ago, and Gary and I were in the US working, we were running a workshop. And as always, the work we do is always about how do you unlock people's potential? How do you help them to step into their light of who they truly are? And a young woman came up during the workshop, and it was a group conversation session, and she shared with us that she'd had many, many, many years of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual. And she'd also spent many years going to therapists and counsellors, and she's only in her early 20s. And while she had made progress in her mind, she was, moving through the trauma of what she'd experienced, she was still very much identified with it, understandably. When we had the wholeness conversation with her, we helped her to recognise that even in those darkest, most horrible times, there'd been a part of her that knew she wasn't the experience she's had. That knew that this wasn't actually meant to be happening to her. This wasn't right, it wasn't who she was. And so through the conversation, she suddenly was reintroduced to that part of her. At the end of the conversation, and it literally was only 10 minutes, she said it was the first time that she felt that she'd actually been seen and heard. Now, this is definitely not to say that the other people she'd seen hadn't done a good job, but what they'd been doing and who they'd been talking to was the abuse survivor. That self was very well known, very well recognised, very well heard. But the true essence of her, the whole self, hadn't really been present in those conversations very much. So when she said she felt seen and heard for the first time, what she meant was who she truly was being seen and heard. Now, a few months later, we received an email from her. And she said that that night had been a complete game changer for her, and that she'd had the best summer that she'd ever had. That she was going into her friendships differently, her relationships. She was seeing herself and making different choices from that place of her wholeness, because she was now having a wholeness conversation with herself. When she started to be identified with the self that had been through that terrible trauma and abuse, she remembered that that other true self, the whole self, was also there. And so with the awareness, she was able to make that choice to come back to being and acting and living as who she truly was. Now, the power of a wholeness approach and having wholeness conversations with ourselves and with others is perhaps seemingly simple, but quite profound. And it goes to the understanding of neuroplasticity, which has already been mentioned today. The fact that our brains are malleable, our brains change. So if we keep having conversations with ourselves as a survivor of whatever it might be, or in Lucy's case, as someone who isn't very good or isn't very confident, what you do in those situations is you keep reinforcing and strengthening the neural pathways of that identity, of that way of responding emotionally or mentally to a particular event. When we start to see ourselves differently and have different wholeness conversations with ourselves, when we interact and act from our wholeness as much as we can, we start to have different neurological pathways created. We change who we are, not just in our thinking, but in our very physiology. And that creates a foundation for all sorts of magic to unfold. So I'd like to give you just a quick way to experience this, because it's something if you want to play with it after today. If you're comfortable, close your eyes, otherwise just look down and just think of somebody you care about who you know is going through a difficult time. And see them as the difficulty they're experiencing, the trouble they're having, whatever it might be. And think about having a conversation with them as that. What might you say? How might you feel in the conversation, and how do you think they might be feeling? And now, make the shift that the girl in America and Lucy did, and see them in their wholeness. See the aspect of them that isn't being affected by whatever it is that they're experiencing. That true light, the essence, the perfection that's still there. And as you see and feel them as that, as you know them as that, notice how you feel, and become curious about what you might say differently to them. How they might respond differently to that kind of conversation. Wholeness conversations happen at all sorts of levels. People feel it when we see them in their wholeness. We feel who we truly are when we see ourselves in our wholeness. So play with wholeness conversations, play with seeing yourself in your wholeness, and just be curious about what becomes possible and what you notice changes in your world. Thanks so much.